Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, this agenda item should not be diverted by fallacious allegations by the United States delegation, when in an overwhelming way this Assembly has sent out an unequivocal message as to the urgent need to bring an end to the blockade against Cuba. In his statement, the representative of the United States government mentioned that they feel concerned about the plight of the Cuban people. How can his government justify the fact that it used the COVID-19 pandemic to step up its inhumane blockade against Cuba and prevent us having access to treatment and basic products to produce our own vaccines, as well as to pulmonary ventilators and even the purchase of medicinal oxygen? The United States say that they advocate for individual freedoms in Cuba, and yet they have not reversed the restrictions that are having a direct impact on Cuban entrepreneurs in areas such as software development, hospitality, and other areas. If the United States government really did care for the well-being, human rights, and self-determination of Cuban people, it could lift the embargo and cooperate with our international cooperation. Mr. President, Cuba has been and continues to be the subject of a dirty campaign directed by the United States government and by politicians within that country. The lying has been one of its fundamental parts. It is false to say that it did not detain those people who were protesting on the 11th of July 2021, against whom crimes were committed during those protests. They were prevented from having procedural guarantees. No one has been prosecuted for expressing their opinion. It is inadmissible that they purport to say that we have unbalanced our international order, when it is actually this country that has seen the detention of more than 800 people following the events on the 6th of January 2021 in the White House. Is the United States the only country in the world with the right to defend its institutions, like any other country would do? We will not allow law to be broken or the services of an external regime change order to subvert our political system that we as Cubans have freely chosen. We will continue to strengthen our institutional and legal framework to promote and protect human rights, including the right of association, and we will continue to ensure the full respect for our laws. To desperately express its hostility towards Cuba, the United States is circumventing the issue on arrests, focusing on minors. Cuban authorities have provided enough information to corroborate the respect for due process in our country. They have made it clear that in Cuba, we do not in any circumstances apply criminal responsibility to minors under 16 years of age. The only arbitrary arrests and penitentiary confinement for long periods on Cuban territory is that is implemented and executed by the United States government at the Guantanamo naval base. Mr. President, we can't talk about election, the representative of a country in which electoral campaigns, there are no ethical limits, cannot talk about democracy and elections. In that country, we see racism, xenophobia, slander, and lies. That's a country in which money and corporate interests define who is elected or not. Cuba doesn't need to be taught lessons on democracy and human rights, much less coming from the United States of government, the United States. We will not accept any questioning of this type, particularly when it is used to justify the system of universal coercive measures that is the most prolonged and broad-based that has ever been imposed against any country. The United States government should focus on its own population under the poverty threshold. It should look at its own migrant policy, the repression of minorities and reproductive rights. It should focus on its own lack of gender equality, racism, and discrimination against persons of African descent. It should focus on police brutality, the more than 1,000 deaths per year following shooting by police, secret jails, extrajudicial arrests, and the use of torture. Allow me to just cite two examples of this aforementioned list very specifically, Mr. President. The United States is the only country that is not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The only country in which minors under 18 years of age are sentenced to life imprisonment without any conditional relief. Only in 2021 alone, between 6,000 and 7,000 arrests were made of minors in this country, according to the Fund for Child's Defense. Institutional discrimination and police brutality that is untrammeled against persons of African descent, migrants, refugees, and minorities have reached alarming levels in the United States. Persons of African descent only represent 13% of the United States population, but they represent 36% of the total prison population. In 2021, a total of 266 persons of African descent were murdered by the police in the United States. If the United States really wants to look out for and look after the well-being of the Cuban people, it should once and for all and without any conditions lift the economic, commercial, and financial blockade against Cuba. That instead of promoting cooperation and cooperative links with Cuba, the United States is seeking confrontation and is overtly sponsoring a change, a politically designed change in Cuba. The Biden government has asked the Congress in his 2022 budget for $20 million for the so-called programs aimed at promoting democracy in Cuba, and almost $13 million for illegal broadcasts of the so-called Marti TV and radio. This is conduct that is contrary to the high sensitivity shown by that country to any attempt at interference in its domestic affairs, and through which it purports to fabricate political opposition in Cuba and to break down our constitutional order. Mr. President, the North American delegation is lying when it cites extremely high levels of exports and humanitarian aid to our country. It is cynically using multi-million-dollar amounts from funds that the UN International Development Agency is granting to subversion in Cuba, as well as the efforts that are made to and sent to Cuban emigres, or the modest donations that are made, overcoming great obstacles that are granted by non-governmental organizations. There is irrefutable proof that the blockade hampers the main channels of the sending of aid to the country, including from third countries. This in the midst of a conduct of COVID-19, in the context of the pandemic. Following the passage of the hurricane, the United States government should have the human duty.
I therefore request the representative of Cuba to conclude his statement.
Yes. Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, I conclude my statement in the exercise of the right of reply by reiterating something that was stated just a few days ago by the Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel. He said, "We have firmly and creatively faced the application of the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States that has been opportunistically worsened during the times in which we were facing the pandemic. The Cuban people did not cede either to the subversive media campaigns. No obstacle will be enough to erode our determination to resist, to fight, and to win." Thank you very much.